Goulston Street, East London. September 30th, 1888, 2:55 in the morning. A constable named Alfred Long steps into the entryway of a block of cheap flats. He has walked this beat all night. 35 minutes earlier, he passed this exact doorway, and there was nothing here. Now there is something on the floor, a piece of a white apron, wet with blood. Within hours, a police surgeon will match that scrap of cloth to a woman found less than half a mile away in a public square, with her uterus and her left kidney cut out of her body. It is the only object the killer is known to have carried away from a murder scene. And Long is not finished, because on the dark brick above it, someone has written a sentence in chalk. By 5:30 that same morning, the sentence is gone, washed off the wall. Not by rain, not by a passerby. On the direct order of the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, who came to Goulston Street himself, stood in front of the writing, and decided it could not stay there until daylight, while officers from the other police force working this case argued for one thing: time to photograph it. They were refused. 4 men had copied the words down before it was erased. All 4 wrote something different. 2 of them wrote a version that means the exact opposite of the other 2. Everything the world has ever claimed to know about Jack the Ripper is built on top of that morning. On a record the investigation kept damaging, files that left Scotland Yard and never came back. A letter that gave the killer his name, missing for nearly 100 years, mailed back anonymously in 1987 by someone who has never been identified. The one witness who may have watched a murder begin, never called to give evidence in open court. And in 2019, a laboratory announced it had solved the whole thing, using a piece of cloth that no document from 1888 has ever been shown to mention. This is not the story of who Jack the Ripper was. It's the story of how, step by step, we lost the ability to ever find out. To understand what was taken from the record, we have to start 5 months earlier, with a woman whose name almost no one remembers. In 1888, London was the largest and richest city on earth. It was also 2 cities that barely touched. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and the streets around them made up a district of roughly 250,000 people packed into a few square miles. Most of them had no fixed home. They paid for a bed by the night, a few pence for a bunk in a common lodging house shared with dozens of strangers. If you could not raise the money by closing time, you walked. All night, until the doors opened again. That is the detail that matters most in this case, and it is the one most often left out. A large number of people in this district were awake and outdoors between midnight and dawn, not because they wanted to be, but because they had nowhere to lie down. The streets were not empty. They were full of people with no reason to be anywhere in particular, and no one waiting for them. Gas lamps were sparse. Courts and alleys ran between buildings with no lighting at all, and the district sat on a border. Most of it was policed by the Metropolitan Police, headquartered at Scotland Yard, but a small area, the old square mile of the City of London, had its own entirely separate force, with its own commissioner, its own detectives, and its own procedures. The line between them cut straight through the ground where these murders happened. 2 forces, 2 chains of command, 1 killer, if it was 1 killer. And they were investigating with tools we would not recognize as investigation at all. There was no fingerprinting. Britain would not adopt it for another dozen years. There was no way to determine a blood type, let alone match blood to a person. There was no technique for preserving a crime scene, no standard for photographing one, no forensic laboratory to send anything to. Detective work in 1888 rested on 3 things: a confession, a witness, or catching a man in the act. That is the whole toolkit. Remember it, because everything that follows is the story of what happened to the few pieces of physical evidence this case ever produced, in the hands of men who had almost no way to read them. The file does not begin in September, with the murder everyone knows. It begins in April, with a woman named Emma. The official police file is titled, simply, The Whitechapel Murders. It covers 11 deaths, between April 1888 and February 1891, 11. Almost every account you have ever heard of this case discusses 5. The first name in the file is Emma Elizabeth Smith. In the early hours of the 3rd of April, 1888, Smith was attacked near the junction of Osborne Street and Brick Lane. She survived the attack. She walked back to her lodging house on her own. It was only when the deputy saw the state of her that she was taken to hospital. She was able to speak, and she gave an account. She said she had been set upon by more than one man. She died the following day of peritonitis. Police concluded she had most likely been attacked by a gang, one of the extortion gangs that operated in the district, preying on exactly the kind of women who had to be outside after midnight. Most researchers today accept that conclusion, but her name opens the file. That is a fact of the record. The investigation that became the most famous manhunt in history began with a woman almost nobody can name. 4 months later, on the 7th of August, Martha Tabram was found on a landing in George Yard Buildings, a tenement block a short walk away. She had been stabbed 39 times. Whether Tabram belongs to the same series is one of the oldest arguments in this case, and it has never been settled. Some senior officers at the time thought she did. Most researchers now think she did not. Nobody can prove either position. Then, over the following 10 weeks, came the 5 deaths that the world remembers, and after them. After November 1888, when almost every account of this case stops, the file kept going. December 1888, Rose Milet, found in Clark's Yard, Poplar. 4 doctors who examined her concluded she had been strangled. The head of the Criminal Investigation Department, Robert Anderson, maintained she had died by accident while intoxicated. The inquest jury returned a verdict of murder. July 1889, Alice Mackenzie, in Castle Alley. Her throat was cut. There were wounds to her abdomen, but they were shallower than in the earlier cases and made with a shorter blade. The police surgeons split. Thomas Bond believed this was the same killer. George Bagster Phillips, who had examined the earlier bodies, disagreed. Inspector Aberline, the man who had run the ground-level investigation the year before, did not think so either. September 1889, a torso, found under a railway arch in Pinchin Street. No head, no legs. The rest was never recovered. Chief Inspector Swanson connected it to a separate series of dismemberment cases along the Thames, not to Whitechapel. February 1891, Francis Coles, in Swallow Gardens, found by a constable who heard footsteps walking away from him in the dark. A man named James Sadler was arrested. There was not enough evidence to charge him. He was released. 11 women, 11 files, and a number. 5. That has organized this entire case for over a century. Where that number came from is not a mystery. It has a specific and documented answer. It just is not the answer most people assume. The 5 deaths at the center of this case happened in a window of 10 weeks. Mary Ann Nichols, found at around 20 minutes to 4 on the morning of the 31st of August, 1888, lying in Bucks Row, a narrow street of terraced houses and warehouse walls. Her throat had been cut. There were injuries to her abdomen that the surgeon did not notice until she reached the mortuary. She was known as Polly. She had 5 children. She had been married for over 20 years before the marriage broke down. On the night she died, she had been turned away from a lodging house because she did not have 4pence. According to the deputy who turned her away, she said she would soon get the money and pointed at the bonnet she was wearing. It was new. Annie Chapman, found at about 6 in the morning on the 8th of September, in the backyard of number 29, Hanbury Street. A house occupied by 17 people, most of them asleep, a few feet away. Her throat had been cut. Her uterus had been removed and taken from the scene. She was 47. She had been married to a coachman. 2 of her children had died. She had been ill for some time. The post-mortem found disease of the lungs and the membranes of the brain. On the last night of her life, she told the deputy of her lodging house that she did not have her DOS money and asked him not to let her bed. Her exact words were recorded. Not to let it. She would not be long. Elizabeth Stride, found at about 1 in the morning on the 30th of September in Dutfield's Yard, a gated passage beside a working men's club on Berner Street. Her throat had been cut. There were no other injuries. That absence matters, and we will come back to it. She was Swedish, born near Gothenburg, and had come to London in her 20s. She had been married to a carpenter. She spoke Yiddish as well as English, which in that district was a working skill. Catherine Eddowes, found at 1:45 the same morning in Mitra Square, inside the city of London, across the border, less than an hour after Stride. Her throat had been cut. Her uterus had been cut. Her uterus and her left kidney had been removed. The city police surgeon, Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, testified at the inquest that whoever did this had some anatomical knowledge. And he built that on one specific point. "The left kidney," he said, "is easy to miss. It sits behind a membrane. Someone who did not know where to look would not have found it." Catherine Eddowes had spent much of the previous 20 years with a man named John Kelly. She had been in Kent that autumn picking hops and had walked back to London. She was 46, Mary Jane Kelly, found at about 11:15 in the morning on the 9th of November in a single rented room, number 13, Miller's Court. She was the youngest of the 5, in her mid-20s. She was the only one of the 5 killed indoors, behind a door that could be closed. We will not describe what was done in that room. It is enough to say that for the first and only time, the killer had hours and privacy and used both. Now, the argument. There is a serious and ongoing dispute among historians about who these women actually were. The traditional account holds that all 5 were working as prostitutes. In 2019, the historian Hallie Rubenhold published a study of their lives arguing that this was largely an assumption made by the press and the police in 1888, that the documentary evidence supports it for only some of them, and that several may have been killed while sleeping rough in the open. Other researchers have contested specific parts of that argument. We are not going to resolve it here, and it would be dishonest to pretend it is resolved. What can be said is this. For 130 years, one word was used to describe 5 different women with 5 different histories, and it did a great deal of the work that evidence should have been doing. And then came the night when the killer, for the first time, left something behind. The 30th of September, 1888. Follow the clock. Around 1:45 in the morning. A man named Israel Schwartz is walking down Berner Street. He is a Hungarian Jew. His English is limited enough that when he later gives his statement to police, he does it through an interpreter. He sees a man stop and speak to a woman standing in the gateway of Dutfield's yard. He sees the man take hold of her and throw her to the ground. He hears a shout. He also sees a second man standing on the other side of the street, holding a pipe. Schwartz does not intervene. He walks away. Around 1 o'clock, Elizabeth Stride is found in that gateway. Her throat has been cut. There are no other injuries. Nothing done to her body beyond the wound that killed her. The steward of the club drives his pony and cart into the yard, and the pony shies away from something in the dark. That absence of further injury has fueled a century of argument. One reading is that the killer was interrupted, that the cart arriving is what stopped him. Another is that Stride was killed by someone else entirely. Neither can be proven. Around 1 o'clock, the same hour, a mile away, at Bishopsgate Police Station, Catherine Eddowes is released from a cell. She had been picked up earlier in the evening, too drunk to stand, and held until she sobered up. The constable on duty lets her out. She says good night to him. She walks off in the direction of Houndsditch. She had been in police custody, and the police let her go because there was no lawful reason to hold her into a district where a woman had been killed less than an hour earlier. News that had not yet reached that station. 1:30. Police Constable Edward Watkins of the City of London Police walks his beat through Mitre Square. He testifies later, under oath, that the square was empty. He carries a lamp. He looks into the corners. 1:45. Watkins returns. 14 minutes have passed. Catherine Eddowes is lying in the corner of the square, in a space that 3 separate police officers passed through that night, a few yards from a watchman, in a square with a night beat running through it. 14 minutes to kill a woman, remove 2 internal organs in darkness, and be gone. And then, at 2:50, a Metropolitan Police constable named Alfred Long walked into a doorway on Goulston Street and found something no one had expected this case to produce. Physical evidence. In writing. Here is what the record establishes about the next 3 hours. At 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, Constable Long passed the entryway of the model dwellings at 108 to 119 Goulston Street. He stated at the inquest that there was nothing there. At 5 minutes to 3, he passed again. On the floor of the passage was a piece of white apron, stained with what he described as fresh blood. It was later matched to Catherine Eddowes. It had been cut from the apron she was wearing. Nothing else the killer touched in this entire case was ever recovered. Goulston Street was outside the City of London, so the piece of cloth belonged, evidentially, to one force, and it had been found in the territory of the other, and above it, on the wall, was the chalk writing. Long copied it down. Word reached both forces. A City of London detective, Daniel Halse, arrived and copied it. A city surveyor copied it. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson of the Metropolitan Police recorded a version. Compare them. Constable Long wrote, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Detective Halse wrote, "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." The surveyor wrote, "The Jaws are not the men to be blamed for nothing." Swanson wrote, "The Jews are not the men to be blamed for nothing." Read those again. Two of them place the word "not" in a position that reverses the meaning of the sentence. One version says a group will not be blamed. Another says they are not the ones who will be blamed. And nobody agrees on the spelling of the word at the center of it. A word that, spelled that way, is not standard English at all. This is a single short sentence, copied within minutes, by men standing in the same doorway, at least two of them police officers whose job was accurate recording. Then the argument began. The City of London officers wanted the writing photographed. Photography existed. It was slow, but it existed. Their position was that this was evidence found directly above evidence, and that it should be recorded properly before anything was done to it. Superintendent Arnold of the Metropolitan Police had already sent for a sponge, and then Sir Charles Warren, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the most senior police officer in London, arrived at Goulston Street in person. In his own report to the Home Secretary, dated the 6th of November, he wrote that he went to Goulston Street immediately, before he went to the murder scene itself. He looked at the writing. He noted that it was getting light, and that the public would be in the streets within minutes, and he ordered it washed off the wall. Here is where it would be easy and lazy to call this a blunder. It is worth taking Warren's reasoning seriously, because his reasoning is documented, and it was not stupid. In the autumn of 1888, the East End was close to violence against its Jewish population. Tens of thousands of Jewish refugees had arrived from Eastern Europe in the preceding years. A suspect nicknamed Leather Apron had already been circulated in the press, widely understood as Jewish. He had been arrested and cleared. Crowds had gathered. There had been public disorder. Warren wrote that if the writing had been left, there would have been an onslaught upon the Jews. That property would have been wrecked, and lives would probably have been lost. He may well have been right. That is a genuine possibility, and this channel is not going to pretend otherwise. But it is also true that at 5:30 in the morning on the 30th of September, 1888, the only physical trace that may have carried the killer's own handwriting was destroyed on the order of the head of the Metropolitan Police, without being photographed, over the objection of the other force investigating the same murders. We have 4 transcriptions and no image. We do not know if it was the killer's writing. We do not know if it had been there for a week. Warren himself considered that possibility. It may have had nothing to do with the case at all. But that is precisely the point. Because it was erased, the question cannot be examined. Not by the officers in 1888, not by the researchers in 1930, not by a laboratory today. It is the first thing this case lost. It was not the last. Now we need to talk about how a man nobody could identify acquired the most recognizable name in criminal history. Before the 27th of September, 1888, the killer had no name. The press called him the Whitechapel murderer. The police files called him the Whitechapel murderer. There was no persona, no signature, no character. On the 27th of September, the Central News Agency in London received a letter dated 2 days earlier, written in red ink. It mocked the police. It promised more killings, and it was signed with a name. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The agency forwarded it to Scotland Yard on the 29th. Days later, after the double murder, a postcard arrived referring back to it. Police published facsimiles, hoping someone would recognize the handwriting. Nobody did. But something else happened. The name spread into every newspaper in Britain, then into the American press, then into the language itself. And here is what senior police officers came to believe about that letter. In 1913, retired Chief Inspector John Littlechild wrote privately that officials at Scotland Yard had generally believed the letter was written by a journalist. He named Tom Bulling of the Central News Agency itself. In 1931, another journalist, Fred Best, was reported to have said that he and a colleague had written letters signed Jack the Ripper to keep public interest and newspaper sales alive. Neither account is proof. Both are second-hand, both were made long after the fact, and neither has ever been fully verified. But consider what follows if they are even partly right. The single most influential document in this case may have been written by a man selling newspapers. It created the name. The name created a character. The character, theatrical, taunting, deliberate, shaped what the public expected, what the press printed, and what the police were under pressure to produce. And it buried the investigation. Hundreds of letters followed, from all over the country, each one requiring officers to read it, log it, and in some cases chase it. Almost every one was a hoax. Detectives with no forensic science and no fingerprinting spent their time sorting mail. One of those letters was different. On the 16th of October, a small parcel reached George Lusk, a builder who chaired the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local tradesmen who had organized their own patrols because they did not believe the police could protect the district. Inside was half a human kidney and a short letter in a rough hand, headed, "From Hell." Dr. Thomas Openshaw examined the kidney. He confirmed it was human and that it was from the left side. Beyond that, he could not determine anything. Not the age of the person it came from, not how long it had been preserved, not who it belonged to. Catherine Eddowes was missing her left kidney. That is the whole of it. That is all that can honestly be said. Whether the organ came from her has never been established, and with the science of 1888 it could not have been. Some believed it was a grim prank by a medical student. Others did not. The kidney no longer exists, and the Dear Boss letter, the document that named him, vanished from police custody. It was gone from the files for decades. Then, in November 1987, it arrived back at the Metropolitan Police, anonymously, in the post. No one has ever explained where it had been or who kept it. It was not the only thing missing. Here is a question that almost never gets asked about this case. If it is unsolved and the evidence is famous, where is the evidence? Start with what the investigation actually produced. By the end of October 1888, the Metropolitan Police had interviewed more than 2,000 people. They had investigated around 300 of them in detail. They had detained 80. In November and December, 143 additional plainclothes officers were put into Whitechapel. House-to-house enquiries, handbills distributed to every household in the district. Every one of those actions generated paper. Now look at what the leadership was doing at the same time. On the 31st of August, the day Mary Ann Nichols was killed, James Monroe resigned as head of the Criminal Investigation Department after a long dispute with Commissioner Warren. Robert Anderson replaced him on the 1st of September. On the 7th of September, Anderson left the country on sick leave. Annie Chapman was killed the following day. The head of SID was abroad for the beginning of the most intense phase of the case. The two forces could not even agree on the most basic tool available to them. The Home Office instructed the Metropolitan Police not to offer a reward, on the reasoning that rewards produce false information. The City of London Police, working the Eddowes murder in the same district, offered £500. A local member of Parliament, Samuel Montagu, offered 100 of his own money. And on the 8th of November, 1888, Sir Charles Warren resigned as commissioner. The following morning, Mary Jane Kelly was found in Miller's Court. So, an investigation with two commands, a SID chief absent at the critical moment, contradictory reward policies, and a commissioner who resigned the day before the worst killing of the series. What happened to the paperwork of that investigation is worse. A large part of the City of London police records was destroyed in the Blitz, burned in the bombing of London in the Second World War. That is not negligence. That is a war. The Metropolitan Police files are a different story. Over the 20th century, documents went missing from them. Not through fire, through people. Officers and, later, visitors with access removed items, sometimes as souvenirs, sometimes to sell. The Dear Boss letter coming back through the post in 1987 is simply the case we know about, because someone chose to return it. And the process is not finished. In March 2024, an archive came up for auction in England. It had belonged to Inspector Joseph Henry Helson, one of the officers involved in the original investigation, and had passed down through 4 generations of his family. It included 2 photographs of the suspect Michael Ostrog, a copy of the Saucy Jackie postcard, a facsimile of the Dear Boss letter, and a mortuary photograph of Mary Ann Nichols, estimated value around £10,000. Material from an unsolved murder investigation, sold as a collectible. This is the shape of the thing. The case was not sealed and preserved. It was scattered. By bombs, by souvenir hunters, by families, by auction houses, over 130 years, which raises an obvious problem for every name that has ever been offered as the answer. You have heard it said that the police knew who he was. Let us look at exactly where that comes from. In 1894, 6 years after the murders, a senior officer named Melville MacNaughton wrote an internal memorandum. It was written in response to a newspaper naming a suspect, and its purpose was to argue that the newspaper was wrong. In it, MacNaughton wrote that the Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only. That sentence is where the canonical 5 comes from. Not from a coroner, not from a forensic finding, from an internal note written 6 years afterwards to rebut a newspaper. And Melville MacNaughton did not join the Metropolitan Police until 1889, after the last of those 5 deaths. He was not there. The same memorandum named 3 men he considered more likely than the newspaper's candidate. Montague Druitt, a barrister who drowned in the Thames; Aaron Kosminski, described as a Polish Jew living in the heart of the district; and Michael Ostrog, a convict and confidence trickster. There is no physical evidence tying any of the 3 to any of the murders. None of the 3 was ever charged. Then there is Robert Anderson, the SID chief who had been abroad in September 1888. In his memoirs, published in 1910, he made a much stronger claim, that the suspect had been caged in an asylum, that the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer identified him at once, and that the witness then refused to swear to him on learning the suspect was a fellow Jew. Anderson presented this as established fact. Years later, a copy of Anderson's book that had belonged to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the officer who coordinated the whole investigation from Scotland Yard, was found to contain handwritten notes in the margins. Swanson's notes name the suspect, Kosminski. They describe an identification carried out at a police convalescent home on the coast, where the suspect had been taken, in Swanson's phrase, with difficulty. For many people, that settles it. 2 of the most senior men in the case, in private, naming the same man. Now here are the problems, and they are not small. MacNaughton's memorandum states that Kosminski was detained around March 1889. The records show Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a workhouse in July 1890 and to an asylum in February 1891, up to 2 years later than the memorandum says. The men who supposedly knew the answer could not place it in the right year. Anderson's account has the identification happening after the suspect was committed. Swanson's has it happening during a temporary detention. Those are different events. And most importantly, there is no contemporary record of the identification at all. No report from 1888 or 1889 or 1890. No file note. No name of the witness. The single most important moment ever claimed in this investigation. A man who saw the killer, looking at the killer, exists only in the recollections of retired officers, written years afterwards, in a book margin and a memoir. If that identification happened, the paperwork for it is not in the file. We have already seen how many things are not in the file. In 2019, science was supposed to end the argument. The claim goes like this. A shawl, said to have been taken from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder in Mitre Square and kept by a police officer's family, was bought at auction by a private collector. It was tested. Analysis reported mitochondrial DNA from bloodstains on the shawl matching a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, and further DNA matching descendants of Aaron Kosminski. It was announced in a book in 2014 and published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2019. Media coverage carried figures like a 99.2% match. Headlines said the case was closed. Then the geneticists read it. The objections came from serious people. Among them Tory King, a geneticist at the University of Leicester known for identifying the remains of King Richard III, and the science writer and geneticist Adam Rutherford, along with specialists in forensic DNA analysis in Austria. Their criticisms fall into 3 groups, and none of them is about whether the testing was done. They are about whether it could mean what was claimed. First, the type of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is not an individual fingerprint. It is inherited down the maternal line and shared by everyone in that line, and, for common variants, by very large numbers of unrelated people. It can exclude someone. It cannot single out one man out of a city. Second, what was published. Critics pointed out that the paper did not present the underlying sequence data in a form that would let other scientists check the result independently. In forensic science, a result that cannot be independently verified is not yet a result. Third, and most damaging, the object itself. The shawl had been handled with bare hands. It had been photographed being held. It had, by the critics' account, been in the presence of the very descendants whose DNA was being used as the comparison sample. A textile more than a century old, passed through private hands, handled without protection. That is close to the worst possible sample for this kind of analysis. And underneath all of it sits a simpler question. No document from 1888 that has been produced establishes that this shawl was ever at Mitre Square. There is no chain of custody. There is no inventory entry. Adam Rutherford's assessment was blunt. He called it bad science and bad history. This is not a claim that the researchers acted in bad faith. It is a statement about what an object with no documented history can prove, and it brings us back to where this whole story started, on Goulston Street, with a police force washing evidence off a wall before it could be recorded. You cannot test your way out of a broken chain of custody. The science of 2026 is extraordinary. It still cannot analyze something that no one can prove was ever there. But for one family, that laboratory result was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a request. Let us be exact about the legal position, because it is routinely misstated. No one has ever been charged in connection with any of the 5 murders. No one has been tried. No one has been convicted. No inquest ever named a killer. Every man discussed in this case, Druitt, Kosminski, Ostrog, and the dozens of candidates proposed since, is a suspect in the loosest possible sense of that word. A name written down by someone who thought it was worth writing down. Several of them have never been shown to have been anywhere near the murders. No document in the official Whitechapel murders file is dated later than 1896. Then, in January 2025, something happened that had not happened in over a century. Karen Miller, a direct descendant of Catherine Eddowes, went public with a demand for a new inquest. She was supported by a descendant of Aaron Kosminski. Their position was that the DNA work should be examined formally, in a legal setting, and that the killer should be named as a matter of law. Her stated reason was not about the killer. She said people had forgotten the victims, and that the victims had never had justice. In England, reopening an inquest of this kind requires the approval of the Attorney General. An earlier application had already been rejected in 2023 on the grounds that there was not sufficient new evidence. At the time of recording, no publicly confirmed decision has been issued on the 2025 request, and the scientific work at the center of it remains without independent verification. So the file sits where it has sat since the 1890s, open, unfinished, and smaller every decade. Strip away the theories and the suspects, and this is what is actually left unanswered. 1. What did the writing in Goulston Street say? 4 men copied it, minutes apart, and produced 4 different sentences, 2 of which mean the opposite of the other 2. It was erased before it could be photographed. The question can no longer be examined by anyone. 2. Why was Israel Schwartz not called to give evidence at the inquest into Elizabeth Stride's death? He gave a statement to police the same day. He described a man attacking a woman at the entrance to the yard where she was found, minutes before she was found there. His account is in police reports. It is not in the public judicial record. 3. Who removed the Dear Boss letter from Scotland Yard and who posted it back in November 1987. Someone held the document that named Jack the Ripper for decades and decided, anonymously, to give it back. 4. Where did the half-kidney sent to George Lusk come from? A doctor confirmed it was human and from the left side. That is the beginning and the end of what was ever determined about it. 5. Who killed the other 6 women in the file? Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, Rose Milet, Alice Mackenzie. The woman in Pinchin Street, who was never even identified, Frances Coles. Their deaths are in the same file, under the same title, and they have been effectively deleted from the story by a number written in an internal memo 6 years later. Legally, the Whitechapel murders were never closed. They were also never declared impossible to close. They simply stopped. As the officers who knew the most about them retired and wrote their memoirs and contradicted each other and died, and what they left behind kept getting smaller, washed off a wall in 1888, burned in the Blitz. slipped out of a filing cabinet at some point in the 20th century, sold at auction in 2024. We tend to think of this case as a mystery that was never solved. It might be more accurate to call it a record that was never protected, because the strange thing about Jack the Ripper is not how little evidence there was. It is how much of it there once was, and how much of it was destroyed by people who were not the killer. If you had been standing in Goulston Street at 5:30 that morning, with a piece of evidence on the wall in front of you and a neighborhood behind you that might have burned if you left it there, what would you have done? And of everything in this file, which loss do you think cost the investigation the most? If you want to keep opening files like this one, subscribe.